Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I am your host, Shayna, and you are now listening to a bonus track episode for Fairytale Origins as requested for none other than Rapunzel, aka Persinette. Thank you for those of you who have hit subscribe, who have liked, who have commented, who have simply come here and spared your time with me, but also giving time to working on yourself, your other relationships, and especially the one with the Most High. Amen. So let's go ahead and dive into today's content. But before doing so, just have to let you know of a few disclaimers. Today's episode, in my opinion, is not suitable for children under the age of 18 for the following trigger warning, but today's content features kidnapping, abusive parenting, abandonment, mutilation, unplanned pregnancy. Okay? So if you're not interested in any of those, or you may find this triggering, today's bonus content may not be for you. Okay? No shade. And if you may be listening to this and you feel that you are triggered by said things, if you haven't already, please consider seeking professional help. We live in a day and age now where it is actually socially acceptable to work on yourself. Okay? And on this channel, I do believe in learning to extend yourself and others grace the way God has extended each of us grace. Amen. So let's get into a little bit of backstory on Rapunzel, aka Persinette. So, one of the earliest written versions of Rapunzel was first published by none other than Friedrich Schultz in the late 1700s, and his story was actually an adaptation of the French folklore story named Persinette, which was first recorded by Charlotte Rose de Caumont de la Force and was published in 1698. Please don't come for my pronunciation, okay? It's 4 a.m. I'm tired. I have tried to record this for you 3 times, and this is the smoothest it's gonna get, okay? I love y'all that much. Thank me later. Now, this story was then published by none other than the Brothers Grimm in the year 1812. Now, for those of you who know who the Brothers Grimm is, they're pretty famous for telling origin stories, and they were responsible for writing and remixing a lot of origin stories, as well as other authors, but they're pretty prominent. So their names are Jacob Ludwig Grimm and Wilhelm Karl Grimm, okay? And they were folklore collectors in the early 1800s and decided to comprise folklore that would honor their German heritage in combination with neighboring areas. And their version was a tad bit watered down for this story of the original Persinette. Some details were swapped out, like instead of a jealous fairy, they incorporated a jealous witch. Okay, so a lot of the stories these men wrote were simply adaptations from oral traditions in Germany and in other surrounding areas. But one of the most interesting things that I came across while doing research for this and comprising all different versions, but closest to the original of Persinette. Allegedly, the story of Persinette is rumored to be an actual account of an Italian woman who was referred to as Saint Barbara in the 3rd century. And Saint Barbara was a 3rd century Christian martyr. Okay, so for those of you who don't know what that entails, in the 3rd century in Rome, a lot of these colosseums were basically made for entertainment to kill believers in Christ. Okay, they were eaten alive by starving lions, and this was entertainment to the Romans. Gross, I know. So if this story is true and there was a Saint Barbara, hats off to her for being a martyr. Okay, but basically, the rumor was that Saint Barbara, her father, was so protective of her and her beauty that he felt the need to lock her in a tower, hence the whole Persinette Rapunzel thing. So ultimately, all the tellings of this story, whether you are familiar with Rapunzel, the adaptation, or Persinette, the original, they all have the same elements of the story. The core of it being there's the maiden with the long hair, the tower, and the prince. And it all ends with a happy ending. But the original tale stretches back about 1500 years before the Brothers Grimm were even thought of. Also, many of the listeners for today's bonus track may be familiar with Rapunzel being the name of a vegetable. However, in earlier adaptations, the crop that was taken was supposed to be a bellflower, and the scientific name was Campanula rapunculus, or however you say it. It's all a blur to me at 4 a.m. But nevertheless, here we go. The story begins with Hugo, a doting husband and soon to be father, and his pregnant wife, Constance. Hugo had decided to take care of all housework as his very pregnant wife waited in anticipation for their soon to be first child to enter into the world. As time grew nearer, Constance could sense that Hugo felt as if he was not an adequate role model for his soon to be born child. After all, she did notice due to their financial situation, they could not afford to feed themselves and their growing baby as those who were well off would. Her stomach, oddly enough, started to look smaller and smaller by day. However, she assured her doubting husband that despite them being nervous, all should be fine, especially being that nervousness is a good indication of his willingness to be his best. And if he wasn't nervous, then she would be more nervous. With Constance's reassurance, they began to talk future plans, not caring if their child was a girl or a boy, and would often choose names before bed. But on one particular day, Hugo returned home meeting Constance's glare as she stared out the window into the backyard of their neighbor as she washes the dishes. "What is it that has stolen the attention of my wife?" says Hugo. Constance began to hungrily lick her lips as she voices that her current pregnancy cravings is for a salad. I don't know, but of all pregnancy cravings, ladies, I don't know if I can relate to no salad. Kudos to you. If anybody had pregnancy cravings of a salad, let me know in the live chat. Let me know in the comments. so I can stop judging you and be your friend so you can encourage me to be my best self, okay? We all should eat more salads. Let me get back to this. I play too much. Hugo, to his dismay, tells Constance that he cannot afford to once again go to the market anytime soon. She shook her head, interrupting his monologue about their tight finances, and pointed out the window into the neighbor's backyard in the garden. Everything we need are in these fields. As she told him to look, she saw rows upon rows of luscious rampions with their purple folds rustling under the glistening sunset sky. Hugo, half listening to his wife's rants about the rampion, could think of nothing except whose garden it belongs to. Moran, the dreaded spinster, the most feared resident within the land. Now, Moran was rumored to have been a participant of black magic and was never one to greet anyone, including her neighbors. How could I possibly barter with someone so reclusive and intimidating? Hugo thought. Constance, being persistent and still hungry, suggested Hugo go and get what he needed. Being that she's noticed Moran leaves the gate to her garden wide open quite often, she insisted Moran probably wouldn't even mind if a few of her vegetables went missing in such a garden as hers. Constant, Constance, girl, bye. With Constance's reassurance of such a well thought out plan, Hugo became less fearful and more determined to take care of her and the well being of their child. But he also thought to himself, stealing is wrong and it could be so dangerous. Though Constance begged to the point of perspiration, Hugo sat his wife down and told her that the craving would pass. But surely enough, it did not. The following days were rough, to say the least, as Constance began to feel ill. With a fever so strong, she felt it was nearly impossible to sleep and stay asleep. Though Hugo, in his efforts, tried to make sure Constance was well nourished with all meats and breads they could spare, she still was dissatisfied. One afternoon, as the sunset turned to complete darkness, Constance cried out to Hugo to help her. With her stomach noticeably and frighteningly smaller than the previous days, Constance told Hugo, if I don't have this craving satisfied, I fear that I may not be able to carry out this pregnancy. The desperation of Constance became the driving factor Hugo needed to become the very thing he was scared to become, a literal thief in the night. Hugo, being proud that amongst many he was considered an honest man, he hated seeing his wife so sick and miserable, especially while carrying his very first child. With bravado, yet humility, he emptied out a small sack and made his way towards the spinster's yard. Just like Constance predicted, she watched Hugo enter the yard, gate opened, just as she said it may be. She thanked the Lord for such good luck. Making straight for the bed of rampion, he took as many as he could, stuffing them into his sack, and returned as quickly as he could without making a peep. Constance eagerly waited by the door, preparing her stolen goods, and greedily ate all within little to no time without offering to share. Hugo sat back in both amazement and relief to see his wife feeling better instantaneously after seeing her sick for what felt like forever. After finishing the enormous salad, Constance turned over to Hugo, telling him, I need more. I'm still not yet satisfied. Constance begged for her husband to go back into the spinster's yard the following night. Hugo, being the loving husband that he was, could not refuse. He agreed to once again go the following night. This time, though, he emptied two large sacks and made his way towards the bed of Rampion. This time, he attempted to gather as much as 3 days' worth of salads so that he could satisfy her cravings. God forbid she would ask him to go back anytime soon. Just as he finished gathering the last of the rampion, he froze in his tracks and began to tremor uncontrollably when he heard the back door of Moran's backyard creaking open on its hinges. A cold gush of wind brushed the leaves surrounding Hugo as Moran moved closer on her lush garden. Who goes there stalking through my garden? Said Moran, with curiosity and a hint of disgust in her voice. Frightened and confused Hugo turned to every which direction in the garden that casted a shadow. The disembodied voice left him confused as to which direction the question came from. He stood silent and afraid. Wind still rustling through the foliage, Moran stepped behind Hugo. Her stature, tall. Her appearance, unearthly. Her lip curled into the most unsettling, unnatural grimace. Hugo dropped both sacks of rampion, lettuce, cabbage, and Rapunzel, falling to his knees as he submitted himself to whatever came next. He began to feel power radiate from her as she stood over his cower. Despite her looking human, one could assure she walked with a supernatural aura. Indeed, this was some type of elderly fairy. He couldn't help but drown in his thoughts of what the crone may do to him next. Tell me, what are you doing in my garden? And don't lie to me, or I'll bury you alive and grow mushrooms from your rotting corpse, screamed Moran. Trying his best to form words while minimizing his stammering, Hugo gave her every elaborate detail. He pleaded with her in hopes she would have some mercy behind her stone cold stoic expression. Your wife wants my greens? She smiled maliciously. He tried his hardest not to look at Moran too long to disguise his disgust and fear. She does, more than anything in the world, he replied. Then she may have them, said Moran. Elated, Hugo began to gather the stolen goods dropped from his sacks, endlessly thanking her between scooping up all the bundles of vegetables. I don't know what I would do to repay such a kind gesture. In truth, you have saved a pregnant woman from sorrow. Moran, holding a finger to his lips, interjected and replied, I am not giving these to you. I plan to barter. Hugo slowly stepped back from the fairy's finger, nervously awaiting to hear what she was interested in as he raised an eyebrow. What could a great fairy want from a humble man with not much within his possession? I do not ask for much. All I want is your child. You will give her to me, and I will care for her as my own. Hugo's heart sank to his stomach. Constance and Hugo had tried for many years to become pregnant, with each year becoming increasingly less hopeful. Of all the things to ask, he thought, tears gathering in his eyes, Hugo replied, "Please, anything but this. Does this deal seem fair to you?" As her eyes widened angrily and jaw clenched. "Or shall I punish you and your unborn daughter for the rampion you've already stolen from me the previous day?" In full fledged anxiety, Hugo agreed to the terms and conditions of his fate. After the approval, the fairy instantly retreated to her cottage. Hugo, not yet feeling the entirety of his consequences, slowly gathered his sacks and made his way out of the iron gate. His mind flooded with thoughts, and his steps felt heavier and heavier as if walking in quicksand. He thought to himself, how could I begin to tell Constance that I bargained our first unborn child away for salad? He further pondered. It is known that fairies like to use human infants for wicked purposes. Perhaps her open gate was to lure and entice anyone brave enough from the very beginning. That must have been her plan. Had she cast a spell on my wife to make her want nothing but the rampion? By the time Hugo got back with both sacks, ravenous Constance, with her arms crossed impatiently, had a fit. Hugo, unloading the bags, revealed rampion, cabbage, lettuce, and none other than Rapunzel. That night, Constance experienced the best sleep of her entire life. Meanwhile, her husband stared at the ceiling all night as he came to terms with the devil's bargain. Months had passed by, and Hugo, without saying a word, had almost entirely forgot about his neighbor's barter. In the remaining months of her pregnancy, not once did Constance crave another salad. They returned with equal anticipation for their daughter, to which Constance still did not know of the sex. That faithful morning, when Constance and Hugo rejoiced after delivering their baby girl, Moran stood right in the doorway as Hugo's face changed from a smile to a frown, handing over his daughter with no hesitation. Hugo refused to look at Constance in the face as he walked towards the other side of the room, head hung low. He began to tell her all about that dreadful encounter months prior and the deal that was struck to save his life and the baby's. After his retelling of said events, he walked towards his wife in hopes to stretch out his arms and comfort her, but she slapped his hand away and sobbed uncontrollably, refusing to talk to her spineless husband. For Constance, in that moment, their marriage would never be the same. For years, Constance and Hugo forcefully watched their daughter, who was named Persinette, by her mother, across the yard in Moran's garden, every birthday, every holiday was a painful reminder. As time flew by, Persinette's stature and hair grew dramatically as she blossomed into such an elegant young lady. Her hair grew so long that she would carry it as it trailed behind her like the train of a wedding dress. The then 11-year-old wanted for nothing. She spent the majority of her days in the fairy's masked garden, singing effortlessly and frolicking to and fro. The only thing she was not allowed to partake in, other than cutting her hair, as per Moran, was singing. Songs are for the birds to sing, not for my Persinette, said the fairy. Persinette scoffed and continued when the fairy wasn't around. After all, there wasn't much else she could do that she enjoyed, being that Moran never let her leave the safety of their cottage and very large fields. Surely her mother would understand. Today, of all days, there was plenty to sing about. Tomorrow was her 12th birthday. She couldn't wait to see what gifts the fairy would have. Persinette slept dreaming of what her mother could possibly give her on such a birthday. Perhaps she can finally meet some of the other children her age outside of this compound, she thought. Persinette knew only of her presumed mother, and she loved her dearly. However, she always wondered what other interesting people she may have had the chance to meet. There was only so much to hear about fairy potions and gardening before she could roll her eyes and gesture her disinterest behind her mother's back. Persinette awoke from her slumber on the morning of her 12th birthday to a blinding light above her head. She blinked, eyes adjusting as she stepped out of her bed into an unfamiliar room where she slept. The walls were stone and polished. The furniture was different but decorative nonetheless. And the ceiling towered over her, making her feel so small, yet important. Persinette approached the large window, looking out. The treetops became smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they were unseen on the sides of neighboring mountainsides. She looked out in awe and disbelief. What a view! Shortly after she looked down, she noticed the 70-foot drop. In fear, she recoiled, turning her back towards the window, looking around the room for some sort of door or staircase. Out of nowhere, Mother Moran appeared to her in an instant like a flicker of light. Look at all I have made for you for your birthday, my child. You are a woman now, and a woman needs her own residence. Confused yet excited, Persinette froze, not knowing how to react to said news. She had no problem at all with her previous living quarters, closer to the ground. How could this be what is best, she thought. Is this what every young woman goes through before reaching adulthood? A private tower excluded from the world? Moran continued, My child, the outside world is full of men who prey on young pretty women such as yourself. Here you will be safe from them all. With the shock value slowly dying down and Moran showing her every little detail, she began to appreciate more of the luxuries of having her own place. The furniture was comfy, The walls had shelves all around to store books for every day she remained there, and her wardrobe came completely stocked with the most complimentary dresses. Moran began to explain invisible fairy servants inhabited the tower as well and would fulfill every desire she had. The world was at her fingertips. However, the one rule, said Moran, is that you never cut your beautiful golden hair so that you cast your hair and I can visit you from the ground below. Fair enough, Persinette thought and nodded, as Moran kissed Persinette on the forehead, promising her return and poofed out of sight as a fairy would. Persinette lay perched like a bird singing in her gilded cage. Moran was right. She could never be bored with all the entertainment and all things needed to sustain right at her fingertips. With her free time, she had all the time in the world to read, paint, and learn how to play a new instrument. Now that her mother Moran wasn't around, she was even free to sit and gaze outside near the window as the sun beamed upon her while singing out to the mountains. Persinette kept her promise, never cutting her hair. Soon, her hair grew so long she could no longer walk around without being tangled and tripping clumsily. She started to braid her hair in elaborate designs and patterns as she read in storybooks. Eventually, she spent enough years without cutting it, day in and never out, that her hair was able to reach the bottom of the tower. That was when her mother conveniently started to appear again. A few years had passed by, and despite her mother's disinterest in her singing, she was almost relieved having her come back. It was getting a bit mundane and monotonous to entertain herself and have no one to talk to but invisible servants that never spoke back. At her mother's request, she would loop her hair over a hook, creating a pulley system for her mother to gain access going up and down the tower like an elevator. Despite Moran's heaviness, Persinette adjusted. Moran then visited her daughter every day to ensure her safety, she told Persinette. Persinette would soon understand why her mother began to check in daily. A nearby prince visited the surrounding brush in hopes to make his father, the king, proud of his hunting skills within the forest. And despite his father's wishes, the prince knew in his heart he was a man of intellect, not hunting. He would much rather spend his days lost in his thoughts and discussing his ideas and the world around him with his future wife, rather than prove how manly he is to an entire kingdom. Hunting, however, proved to be the best way for his overbearing father to leave him be, even if it was only for a few hours. On horseback, he rode through the woods in an attempt to not return home without game, and through the route of an uncharted route, suddenly he heard the most enchanted singing voice. Stopping dead in his tracks, he began to try and search far and wide for the voice until the voice went from faint to clear as the bright blue skies above him. Moving further and further into the woods and ignoring all landmarks to retrace his step back to the path known, he lost himself in the captivating voice. his focus shifting from animal hunting to woman hunting within minutes. At last, the trees parted farther and farther, revealing a clearing with a large silver tower. The prince's jaw dropped as he inched closer and closer on his horse towards her as she was still perched, singing out, eyes closed towards the mountains. The prince's eyes, almost blinded by the reflection of the sun off of the silver walls, thought to himself, such craftsmanship! I have not seen such a tower before in all of my father's land, yet completely out of place. Dismounting from the horse, he walked closer to the bottom, seeing the voice coming from what seemed to be the only window at the very top of the tower. He circled around, looking cautiously for a door, while noticing the thorn bushes that surrounded the tower's base. No door was found throughout its circumference, but he hid behind the tower, sword drawn as he heard a second person approaching. Through the brambles of thorns, crouched down, he saw an old woman with noticeable magical energy radiating around and from her. Persinette, let down your hair, cried Moran. With eyes widened, the prince observed the makeshift pulley with beautifully decorated golden hair that allowed the fairy to escalate and de escalate from the tower's sole window. He waited as long as possible to study the interaction between both the mother and the daughter. The prince vowed he would return the following night to meet the woman behind the mysterious voice. Returning to his horse, he mounted and retraced his steps as best as he could in the dark of night until he found the familiar path and rode home, dreaming of the mystery woman the entire trip. Like any other day, Persinette woke up with her nose lodged in a book about another adventure she lived vicariously through the characters. Mother Moran's visit came and went per usual, and at nightfall, after reading about another's adventures for the past few days in multiple books, she started to long for an adventure all her own. She gazed upon the night sky and pondered, walking back and forth in her room, her eyes occasionally glancing at the window's hook. She began to imagine what her life would look like, what it would feel like if she gathered up enough courage to leave this isolated dwelling. Her thoughts once again interrupted by the inevitable. Persinette, let down your hair. How could mother be back so soon? She thought. Did she leave something behind? What is it that she could not wait for until morning comes again? She sat up and looked around, but nothing in the room was out of the ordinary. Hurrying to the window, she thought, I mustn't keep mother waiting. She placed her hair through the hook and down the tower, the same she would every day, not thinking twice about it. She grew concerned when she noticed the tug on her hair was a bit stronger and heavier than usual, but chalked it up to her mother rushing with multiple belongings. As she finished pulling up her mother and what she thought was an accompaniment of heavy belongings, a stranger who was not Moran nor a woman stepped through the window's opening. Persinette, perplexed, had never seen a man before, but studied them in her books. The man she saw before her was the perfect version of what she read about and imagined in her head. He was tall, handsome, and shrouded in armor. Was she dreaming? Her inside voice resembled her mother's in that moment, coming in direct conflict of how she felt. He was a man, and men are dangerous. Before she could work herself up enough to snap out of her deer in the headlights stance and scream, the prince reached out his hands in submission, replying, "Don't be afraid. I have not come to hurt you." Unconvinced, she cried, "Who are you?" He introduced himself as the prince, and the story of how her singing from the previous day led him to her tower. "You are the most lovely woman I have ever seen in my life," he exclaimed, a claim that had held weight, being that he has spent his time around many princesses in neighboring kingdoms. The prince, right then and there, decided to drop to one knee as he asked for Persinette's hand in marriage. Flabbergasted, she froze in excitement and fear at the same time. What am I to say? She thought. Is this common? Proposing to someone after knowing them for barely a minute? Persinet, aside from her terrible judgment, studied the way the prince looked at her and could tell in that moment he would do anything for her. And to Persinet, anything was just what she felt she needed. This prince is my way out of this tower, she thought. Mother wouldn't have to worry about my protection with royal guards around. Mother doesn't even have to know. Persinet agreed to the proposal on one condition, that he get her out of his tower at his earliest convenience. Happily, with her ability to think quickly on her feet, she asked, "How will we get married?" In the book she studied, weddings were huge ordeals and required great efforts and an immense guest list. But only the two of them were in her room at the moment. Returning on both feet, he moved closer to her, taking her hand over his palm and enclosing it with his other hand. Nervously, she looked down at his hands, mesmerized by how soft they were. Much softer than her mother's elderly hands. Ugh. The prince replied, "The celebration will take place when I take you back home with me. However, in the meantime, we can still have our wedding night." Now, naive Persinet had no idea of what he meant. That part of her adventures of consummation of marriage never was mentioned in any of the weddings she read about. As the prince kissed her, she remembered that, as far as what she read, love was supposed to be innocent and pure. Then again, those stories always ended once they reached the end where they proclaimed their love and kissed at the altar. She would just have to find out what a wedding night is on her own. Now, laying beside her breathless, avoiding being tangled up in Persinette's hair, the prince comforted Persinette, grateful for his company. Her mind was still fixated on what her freedom would look and feel like. She wondered what it would be like leaving behind the life of where she spent so much of her time concealed and hidden to being seen everywhere. She thought of escape tactics. Maybe if I cut my hair, then tie it to the hoop and then climb down, that would work, she said to the prince. "I would never want you to cut that beautiful hair of yours," he said loudly in disagreement. She blushed, not that she's never heard of those compliments from her mother, but The compliment felt that much more rewarding from the man of her dreams. The prince thought of another plan. Every night, he would bring a scrap of silk from the castle so that over time, without suspicions, she can braid a rope strong and long enough to carry her down from the tower to begin life anew without a trace. All Persinette and the prince would have to do is make sure that Moran never found out about his nightly visits. The more the prince came on nightly visits, the more Mother Moran's visits became dull and uneventful for her. By contrast, her mother's conversation compared to the prince's was lackluster to say the least, being that she now had more than one connection to the outside world around her, and with the prince's help, she knew eventually she was guaranteed access to said world. As months grew by, an awkward conversation had to be discussed with her boring mother due to Persinette's timidness with her fiance. Mother, why are all my dresses not fitting around the waistline? Though she had access to all the best foods by the invisible servants, Persinette didn't quite understand the concept of gaining weight, or, in her case, the source of her weight gain. Moran froze, dropping her belongings. Walking towards Persinette, eyes fixed on her stomach. For several moments, she pressed against her daughter's rounding stomach. After a minute or two, her eyes met Persinette's with gathered tears and rage. How could you do this to me? You've been seeing someone other than me in this place I built for you, haven't you? Confused Persinette wondered why such an innocent question would cause her mother to be so angry with her. No, mother, I listened and took your advice and stayed away from all the dangers you mentioned of the outside world, she cried. Looming over her daughter, she scoffed. You are with child. What man came in this tower? Fighting her nervousness, she deflected, remaining quiet and unable to look Moran in the eyes. She couldn't help but to stare at her wardrobe. Angrily, Moran met her gaze at the wardrobe and pushed until all furniture in her way, walking towards the wardrobe, flew in every which way as she opened the wardrobe, throwing every single dress on the ground in sight until she discovered the unfinished braided silk ladder. So, has some duke or lord invaded this tower and violated you? However did such rich linens reach this very tower? Persinette tried to calm the fairy down. Is it not the greatest thing ever to be proposed to by a prince, the first man to ever lay eyes on me? Now you won't have to spend so much time and energy protecting me. The fairy, infuriated and feeling betrayed, grabbed Persinette by the top of her head and from the folds of her cloak produced a pair of scissors and began chopping away at her daughter's hair. Paralyzed with shock, Persinette did not move or make a sound until Moran was finished, then burst into tears on the floor in the midst of her fallen tresses. She left a few inches behind in comparison to her length of over 70 feet of hair. You will never see this prince again. You will be abandoned in the woods and forced to dwell there on your own, giving birth to his child like an animal. Before she could fix her lips to protest, the fairy, her cut hair, and her new life was gone. Not recognizing her surroundings, her mother had made sure to cast her away from all familiarity, including her old home. Persinette, officially abandoned in the most uncharted and strangest part of the woods, pregnant and alone, in tears. Meanwhile, the oblivious prince had been in the greatest of moods lately. Not even the overbearing king could bring down his mood. He couldn't wait to sneak out the castle after sunset to make his way to his nightly visit with his fiancée. On this day, he came a little earlier than expected, but with his confidence, he couldn't help himself. As long as he didn't run into his fairy mother in law, all was well. He rode up to the tower and called out, "Persinette, let down your hair." As the hair came down through the ring and out the tower, he took hold, awaiting another night of updates from the outside world, accompanied by passion. As he came closer to the window, he thought he was the luckiest man in the world. But, standing in his true love's place, stood her mother Moran with her famous unearthly grin. His love's hair clutched in her wrinkly magic charged fingertips. Stepping into the room and drawing his sword, the prince yelled, "What have you done with my fiancée, fairy?" "You came for your darling princess, but the sweet songbird no longer sings in this nest," said Moran mockingly. "You will see her no more." Believing from what was said and seeing her cut hair, the prince believed that his true love was dead. With trembling hands, he decided to take his sword and charge at the fairy to avenge his love. She reached forward, grabbing him by the throat, and carried him, flung him down out the window, and head first towards the bottom of the tower. Though he landed and his fall seemed to have been broken by something he landed on, reality set in as he began to open his eyes in agony as he fell face first into the briars of the thorn bushes. He yelled in discomfort as he blinked to clear the blood from his eyes. Losing the source of his sight, he was then cursed to wander aimlessly as he got up, eyes raw and useless. Though the pain in his eyes hurt deeply, no pain was greater than the thought of losing the love of his life without saying goodbye. He reached out blindly, literally, to find his way day by day for months towards the path of what he could remember, but he eventually just became a shell of despair. Like an animal, he sustained himself on fruits and berries, and to his dismay, he never heard of a search party come to his rescue. Even if they did, they would no longer recognize him. Months later, meanwhile in the wilderness, Persinette gave birth to twins, one boy and one girl. Unable to rely on her mother or invisible servants, she forcibly created a hut to live in and depended on herself to feed herself and her infants. She survived off of the little knowledge she paid attention to from her mother about gardening, and soon it paid off just enough to sustain them. Years went by, and she began to somewhat adjust to life as a new parent. She sang to her children, but not the hopeful sing song once sang from her old garden life or tower, but a more sorrowful song. Her doubts crept in as she realized, how could she possibly raise her children to be functioning members of society when her own mother failed to raise her properly? Over the years, she did whatever she could while still singing her mournful songs, until one day the prince heard her voice from a distance and instantly recognized his beloved. Soon after, she saw a blind man approaching her home with shoulders draped in what looked to resemble a familiar cloak. She thought, he must have heard my singing. His hair and face was caked in dry blood and dirt, and his clothes were unkempt and tattered. Intimidated by his stature, Persinette quieted her singing as he drew closer to her home, but underneath his exterior, she was drawn to him. With the most hoarse voice, due to screaming and crying from years of torment, he cried in the lowliest of voices, Persinette, let down your hair. Gasping in disbelief, her husband had finally found her after searching for years. She ran to him and embraced him as he knelt down in relief. She stood hugging him still as her tears rolled down her cheeks and touched his eye sockets, his sight magically restored. His first sight being his children that she had raised on her own. Now, meanwhile, Moran kept an eye on her daughter and the lifestyle maintained after all these years. She was beyond irate seeing the prince be reunited with his love and now two children. The evil fairy tried to every spell to her knowledge to make sure the union between her daughter and the prince would be null and void. As her husband came into her dwelling to share his first meal ever with his love and children, Persinette opened the cupboard to find the rampion and other vegetables she had gathered from her garden had been turned to stone. She ran to her nearby well to fetch her husband a drink, but the well was full of venomous snakes instead of water. As the snakes made their way up the well, chasing her back into her home, Persinette looked at the sky to see what was just singing. Songbirds are now fiery dragons flying above her hut, sending darts of fire towards the surrounding trees of her residence. Unable to escape the fiery furnace nearby and now surrounding her home, Persinette decided to go inside and huddle with her children and love to meet their demise. As they embraced each other tighter and Persinette made herself readily available to go out first with all madness and chaos, it finally ceased. Persinette put herself in harm's way, knowing that Moran must have done something behind this. She put herself in the line of fire, quite literally, in hopes that, with her sacrifice, Moran would leave her family alone. The birds chirped, the fire stopped, and they went outside to see a mysterious figure emerge from the foliage. It was Moran. With tears in Moran's eyes, she had never witnessed such sacrificial love the way Persinette had been willing to give up her life first in a blaze of fire. Confused Persinette had never seen her mother cry before. Somehow, seeing true love within their family extinguished Moran's blazing fury within her heart. She gave Persinet and the prince her blessing. Moran returned to their village using her fairy magic, and Persinet, the children, and the prince magically were brought to the castle before the king. The kingdom, far and wide, heard about the miraculous events surrounding the prince and Persinet's love story. The kingdom embraced them, and Persinet vowed to herself she would never let her hair be grown below her shoulders ever again. And for the fairy, well, she was never heard or seen of ever again. And somehow, through all the chaos and madness, they all lived happily ever after. Woo child. Please sound off in the comments because this episode, baby, was loaded. Okay. But at the end all be all, I don't know about you, or as we go through this little mini series I have going on here with fairy tale origins, I hope you guys pay attention because I myself am starting to see a pattern of people's demise, especially for the woman, like I discussed with the delusion and the deception that we spoke about in the previous CD and cassette tape episodes. If you haven't, please go back and listen because it very much applies to today's bonus track. But to those of you who have listened already, you get an extra star. Okay, you're a good noodle. You're a good noodle. Okay, I love you. Now, I just have a few questions because compared to the, I would say, the Brothers Grimm version of Rapunzel compared to Persinette, Persinette doesn't exactly give a reason as to her fairy mother's obsession with her hair. Like, for those of you who are familiar with Rapunzel, you would know that somewhat depending on the version you were told, apparently Rapunzel's hair holds some type of magic power, some crap like that, right? But Personette, this earliest version that came probably like 1500 years before the Brothers Grimm adaptation, doesn't really specify that. And I kind of want to know why. But it's like, I don't want to know why that badly because I'm not about to do a whole seance to try and figure it out to get answers. That's frowned upon, by the way. Please don't go ahead and try and partake in anything when it comes to dead people. All jokes aside, I don't recommend it. The Bible speaks on that as well. But yes, can we also talk about Moran being so damaging, the abuse, just the narcissism. Okay, that's a common theme for those of you who have stuck it out with me for the past few months. There's a pattern here. There's a generational curse here of the fear and failure of parenting. But again, I'm not a licensed psychologist or psychiatrist, so please, I don't want to encourage anybody to be out here diagnosing people with personality disorders. Please don't do that. Leave that to the professionals. But we can look at tendencies, right? She definitely has some narcissistic and sociopathic tendencies to want to hide her daughter from the world in a tower and basically use her as some type of pawn in a chess game. She's not allowed to be admired, married, anything. She's supposed to just die alone like you in a tower. That's sexy, said no one. But I want to ask you guys something, and I might make a part two or track two to this episode just to go over certain things that may arise later as far as questions that you and I both have. So drop all your questions, your concerns, your comments. You know I love a good comment. Drop them comments, y'all. But do you think Moran meant well somewhat to a degree of keeping her shielded from the world, keeping her naive, keeping her oblivious to certain things, especially things like sex? Do you think it was okay for her to do that? Do you think it was not okay? Let me know in the comments. And then, based off what you guys say, I will make a part two and we can go into the psychological things of those components of her not doing that, how damaging that could be or not. Let's talk about it. But until next time, guys, I will be putting out a poll sometime this week, and I will give you guys the choice as to what fairy tale origin you may want me to cover next. The power's in your hands, guys. Choose wisely. Red pill or blue pill. Anywho, I hope you guys have an amazing rest of your day. I love you guys so much. Thank you for sticking this out with me. I am delirious. It is now 5 a.m. my time. I am going to bed. I have to wake up in 2 hours. But I love you so much. I will talk and type to you later. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Later. Oh, yeah, and hit the like button if you like this. Okay? Subscribe if you haven't. Let's be friends. Okay? I love you. Bye, guys.